Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Trolle, and I'm happy to see you. And I was obviously hoping to fill the seats and not only bringing my own team or the people I promised beers to come here. But at the end of the day, I'm happy that you're here, and for those that are not here, I'm guessing they'll get access to a recording of the presentation afterwards. So, the company I work for is called Vibrakustik. It's a Danish company, and we represent Listen, an American company from Boston, and some of you might know their audio testing system called Soundcheck. They make the software package, and they make hardware as well for turnkey audio testing systems. So anyways, I'm happy to be here, and today I'm presenting a paper about Perceptual rub and buzz, also called PRB, and in this case, namely the new type of perceptual rub and buzz algorithms in Soundcheck. This algorithm, called Enhanced Perceptual Rub and Buzz, or EPRB, is a perceptual metric that hears distortion like a human in normal listening conditions, and even in noisier conditions like a production line could be. So this means that it offers repeatability and reliability that's not been seen before within these perceptual distortion metrics. And this makes it really easy to use and really easy to set limits for your end-of-line test. So I'm going to start with a quick history of rub and buzz measurements to put things into perspective. And then I'm going to explain a little about the psychoacoustics of the ear, so that when I explain how the algorithm works, you can actually see how it correlates to the human hearing. And next, I'll discuss the methodology used in the algorithm, and I'll present some of the results compared to earlier perceptual rub and buzz metrics in Soundcheck back from 2010, and also up against a competitive product. And then I'll finish up telling you a little more about other benefits and use cases. So, as you probably know, most of you, end-of-line test of loudspeakers, microspeakers, headphone drivers, and so on, would typically measure a range of parameters like frequency response, THD, polarity, some other stuff, as well as manufacturing-introduced defects such as rub and buzz and loose particles. I'm sure that many of you would rely on software-based systems to identify and reject defective products. So Listen introduced conventional higher-order harmonic distortion for detecting audible distortion way back in '95. And loose particle detection in 2005. And together, these two would do an excellent job in identifying defective units or defective products. So Listen introduced the, that's it. There's always a certain level of false rejection where units with some distortion would fail, even though the fault is completely inaudible to the human ear. And from a manufacturing perspective, we always want higher yields and greater profitability. And this has driven the development of perceptual distortion metrics. And these automated measurements, they replicate the human hearing to detect only audible distortion defects. They increase production line yield by passing the products with inaudible distortion, as the product would still sound exactly as the manufacturer intended. And that was the new one. So, masking curves. So before I explain about the algorithm in detail, I would like to talk a little about distortion measurements and psychoacoustics. So like loudspeakers, that was difficult, the human ear is nonlinear, but different. And the threshold of hearing shows how nonlinear the ear is. That's what you see here on the stage, on the screen. At low frequencies, there's a noise floor due to the blood flow of the ear. And at the higher frequencies, there's actually mechanical coupling loss due to these tiny bones, the ossicles, in the middle ear. And it's really only around 1 to 5 kilohertz that where the ear is the most sensitive, that you have the theoretical 0 dB SPL threshold. So we can correlate the human ear's natural filters to masking curves. The masking curve is essentially the shape of the filter inside the ear, primarily due to the hair cells on the basilar membrane. And we have a limited frequency resolution, and sometimes this is oversimplified as third octaves, but nevertheless, it is a narrowband FFT. Here we go. So as the level increases, these masking curves actually get broader. So there's less frequency discrimination at higher levels. And we also hear less frequency discrimination at lower frequencies, below 1 kilohertz. This is really important for looking at harmonic distortion. So let me show you how this translates into how we hear distortion. So if you look at a 1 kilohertz stimulus at 100 dB SPL, then the threshold of audibility for the second harmonic is about 20 dB down. So the second harmonic can be as high as 10% and still be audible. But as we go into the extremes of frequency, the 10th harmonic becomes audible above 0.1% distortion, because we get less masking far from the fundamental frequency. So this is why you could say that higher order harmonic distortion is a much better way to identify audible distortion than THD. Here are some measured results for speakers, subjectively rated by real people, subjectively rated as either good or bad speakers. So you can see that the good speaker here has far more THD, total harmonic distortion, than the bad sounding speaker. But as it's typical the case, then the second and third harmonic would dominate in this case as well. So really when we say 6% THD, it's really 6% second harmonic, and as I just demonstrated, this can easily be inaudible. So these higher harmonics are really low, about 0.02%. So in the buzzing loudspeaker, the second and third harmonic are about the same as the THD. They're about the same, and the THD is dominated by the power summation of those two. So you can see in the higher order harmonics, we're getting around 0.3% from the 10th and above. And that's really what's audible. So here's some math. But this is why we always measured rub and buzz by looking at higher order harmonic distortion. Generally, the 10th harmonic and above. Examining the individual harmonics identifies specific defects. For example, rattling lead wires tend to be 50th harmonic and above, and a rubbing voice coil would tend to be between 10th and 15th harmonic. So now to make perceptual measurements, so correlation to the human ear, we need to also factor in the perceptual loudness. So rather than the dB/SPL scale, we use an equal loudness contour. So this is similar to an A weighting curve, which is based on this blue, yes you have it, the blue 40 level. And dB/SPL and loudness in fonts, they correlate at a reference frequency of 1 kilohertz. But from that, it varies pretty dramatically depending on level, because the ear starts to compress at higher levels. So if you want to replicate human hearing, it's important to use the correct weighting curve for the sound pressure level you're using. And while we're talking about level, one thing to consider that's often one thing to consider often when listening for distortion is that people crank up the volume to make it easier to hear. The problem with this is, although the speaker will probably distort more, so will your ear, or your ears. So it can actually be easier to hear loudspeaker distortion at a lower level, like 80 dB, instead of higher level, like 90 or above, if you're doing listening tests for distortion. So these are 3 scientific phenomena that contribute to how we hear distortion. And so let's see how I roll my... Sorry. So Listening launched the first perceptual distortion model in 2010, as I mentioned, and it replicated the human ear accurately under normal listening conditions. So going over to the new algorithm, this new enhanced perceptual rub and buzz, EPRB, it has 2 significant differences compared to the earlier PRB. So first, proprietary noise reduction techniques are included, which means that even in the presence of background noise, it gets the same results as you would do in normal environments. And second, the perceptual model is enhanced to offer greater correlation to human hearing. I'll talk a little about how the algorithm works, and then I'll demonstrate the results. So the overall structure of the algorithm is pretty much similar to the original R&B algorithm, and you have the highlighted parts here where there's been major changes since the prior version. So we have an improved filtering, as you can see here, and we have an improved perceptual model, which is pretty much based on the already known algorithms, and then a lot of original research done at Listen Inc. So it makes it a lot easier to work with, and it makes it really really easy to set your limits here. So what happens first in each frequency step is that an auditory filter band converts the FFT spectrum to a bark scale to replicate the ear's natural filters. And then, as I mentioned earlier, our ear is more like a constant percentage filter than an FFT. And the bark scale is widely used in audiology to look at the filter bands inside the human ear. You can see, especially at high frequencies, that the ear starts to power sum a lot of the energy. So there's not a lot of point in having narrow frequency resolution above 10 kilohertz, but you can still perceive some of the lower order harmonics independently. This is important for setting limits for audibility of distortion. So next is the ear weighting and internal noise. So ear weighting looks like the inverse of the threshold of human hearing curve that we saw earlier, and the ear canal acts like a horn, and the transfer function from the outer to the middle ear has a resonance of around 1 to 5 kilohertz. That's a little bump that you see. And it also affects the ear's sensitivity versus frequency. So again, at low frequencies, the ear's sensitivity is limited by its noise floor due to the blood flow, and the high frequency sensitivity is limited due to the mechanical coupling laws. So next in the sequence here, we apply a frequency spreading function, and I showed earlier how the audibility depends on a comparison of the magnitude of the harmonics to the masking curve of the fundamental, and this is what we're doing in this step here. We examine the perceptual spectrum to compare the magnitude of the harmonics to the masking curve of the fundamental. And the magnitude of the harmonics is above the if the magnitude is above the harmonics. If the magnitude of the harmonics is above the masking curve, then it's audible. So it's actually a lot more complex than that. or than I make it sound here. Most masking curve studies use 2 tones or 1 tone plus narrowband noise. And we're dealing with many harmonics here. On top of that, the masking curves change with frequency and level, so it gets pretty complicated. And this is something that's changed significantly in this new algorithm. A lot of original research has been put into this, looking at the loudness of both stimulus and response. So this resulted in the development of these proprietary filters, which are essentially simplified mathematical representation of auditory masking curves to mimic the psychoacoustic filters of the ear. The fundamental and its masking effects are then removed to give the audible distortion of the speaker plus the noise. So this is summed over the frequency range to give the PNL, or perceptual noise loudness, for a single tone of the input signal. On the other branch of the algorithm, the harmonic structure is the harmonic structure of the response is quantified using the power capstrum. This involves some complex signal processing. The capstrum analysis is basically a log spectrum of a power spectrum. So if you look at the Fourier transform of a sine wave, you get one FFT line. And if you have something that's periodic in the frequency domain, such as many harmonics, and you take the power capstrum, you're going to get one capstral line. So essentially, it's data reduction techniques that take hundreds of harmonics and condenses it down to a few capstral lines. So a strong and extended harmonic structure is a signature of rub and buzz. This analysis is also quite sensitive to background noise. So our noise reduction technique here also improves the accuracy of the capstral analysis. In the final step, the result of the harmonic analysis is combined with a perceptual distortion to accentuate the rub and buzz and return a harmonically weighted value for rub and buzz loudness in fons. So that's how it works. So let's look at the performance. So I actually invited Steve Temme, the owner and founder of Listen Inc., to do this part.
First, we'll compare 2 subjective tests. I have 3 loudspeaker samples, one good with almost no distortion, one bad with clearly audible rub and buzz, and one borderline which exhibits a little bit of buzzing that is barely audible. Some people will hear it, others won't. To give you a reference point, I'm going to show you the EPRB results for these 3 loudspeakers when playing back a step sine sweep. I'm actually going to play the speakers for you to hear at a fixed 256 Hz tone, where the maximum distortion occurs, as it's just too hard to hear distortion with a fast sweep. Do the EPRB measurements correlate to what you hear? Here's the good one. Now here's the bad one.
Who hears distortion?
And here's the borderline one. Could you hear the distortion? Don't be surprised if you can't hear the borderline one. A lot of people can't.
Did you hear the distortion on the second speaker? You probably did. Great. So here you have the curves from the measurement. So initially, you have the good speaker, and you can see the harmonic distortion displayed here at 256 kilohertz, and you have the bad speaker and the borderline. So the interesting part, we'll look at what happens when the same speaker is measured multiple times. So Steve and his team, they made 10 measurements for each speaker in a quiet office with no acoustic treatment or isolation, and then they saved the captured response waveforms. So the same waveforms were then input into all three algorithms to ensure consistency in the input data. So the listen's old algorithm would show correlation to subjective listening results. So that's the old one. The bad speaker shows the highest level of audible distortion, and the good speaker has minimum measured distortion, and the borderline speaker is somewhere in the middle. So here you can see the small variation between the 10 measurements for each speaker. So this is due to the background noise. And in a production environment where there's only one sweep on each device, that variation can actually make it difficult to set the limits. So the second graph shows the results for the new enhanced perceptual rub and buzz algorithm with the exact same 10 measurements. So the two algorithms are actually run at the same time during the same test. So, and finally, we're looking at a competitive product newly released, and what we see here is pretty interesting because you might see that the measured harmonic distortion is actually higher at some levels or some frequencies, sorry, even for the borderline speaker. And you see the same great variation from measurement to measurement that I measured, or that I mentioned before, that can actually give you enough variation to potentially reject some tested products in your production line. So I mentioned in the beginning that an important goal in the creation of the algorithm was to reproduce the listening performance of a human ear in a quiet environment by removing the variability of factory noise, which changes constantly due to the environment. That could be, for example, air compressors, forklifts, machine noise, radios, items dropping, and so on. And to evaluate the noise immunity of the new algorithm, we compared the performance of Listen's original and the new algorithms in presence of factory background noise. So this recording of background noise was made inside an end-of-line loudspeaker test chamber at a customer site. And the blue curve would show the calibrated noise spectrum, which is pretty typical of production line noise, and the green curve is the fundamental frequency response of a buzzing loudspeaker in the presence of factory noise. So the test chamber itself attenuates the high frequencies pretty well, but is less effective at frequencies below 300 Hertz, where rub and buzz is typically more dominant. So in fact, below 60 Hertz, the background noise is higher than the loudspeaker's output. So there is a negative signal-to-noise ratio here at 50 Hertz. So to compare the noise immunity of the algorithms, the waveform of a buzzing loudspeaker was recorded in a quiet room using a step sign sweep. And this was then mixed with the factory background noise, as you can see, to create a composite recording as if the loudspeaker had been measured in the test box. So this lets us directly compare the two algorithms with and without background noise. So here on the left-hand side, you can see how the recorded signal in a quiet room is run through the two algorithms. And on the right-hand side, you can see the same signal that's combined with the recorded noise, and again, evaluated in both algorithms. So here we go. So here, this top graph would show the result with the old algorithm in soundcheck, and the green curve would indicate the perceptual rub and buzz without background noise. And the lower level red curve is the measurement with the background noise. So as you can see, the algorithm detects much lower audible distortion in the presence of background noise. And in the lower graph here, we see the performance of the new algorithm with the same input signal. So it shows very little difference in the measured perceptual rub and buzz with and without background noise. So the only slight discrepancy here is the very lowest frequencies where the factory background noise is the highest, about 80 dB SPL. And the loudspeaker on the test has very low output, about 70 dB. So at these frequencies, we have a negative signal to noise ratio. And even though we can attenuate background noise, then no amount of filtering and signal processing can easily overcome a negative signal to noise ratio. So lastly, just a couple of other things to know about the algorithm here that are not directly related to performance. So it uses the same step sign sweep test signal as the other end-of-line tests. So it will not affect your throughput in your factory tests. And it can be added to the end-of-line complete test with no increase in duration. Both algorithms can be carried out at the same time. So there is no need to play a second test signal or use longer stimulus. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but I just wanted to repeat that because it is a perceptual measurement. Then setting limits is very simple because of its straight line at your determined threshold of hearing or acceptable distortion level, regardless of other test parameters such as level and frequency. So I mentioned this here. Great. So, should perceptual metrics replace other methods? So I'm going to finish up to explain how these fit with methods you've probably been using for years, if you're already involved in end-of-line testing of audio products. So the big question is, should perceptual measurements replace the conventional harmonic distortion measurements for production line rub and buzz measurement? And the answer to that, in our opinion, is while they certainly could, with no decrease in perceived product quality, then there's a value in measuring both simultaneously. So the perceptual metrics would offer an excellent pass-fail criterion on whether the product is acceptable to ship, alongside some other metrics such as frequency response, THD, etc. And by using this metric to determine overall pass-fail, you can increase yield as you're not rejecting products with inaudible distortion. So, however, the conventional harmonic distortion and loose particle metrics, they offer greater insight into the health of the production line, particularly if trends are monitored over time. For example, awareness of a drifting parameter, even if it's not yet audible, that enables an early correction of the issue and may prevent wastage or production line downtime. So for optimum profitability, our recommendation would be to use both the perceptual metric to determine whether to ship a product or not, and a more comprehensive test to have some, some metrics that would give you an indication of the health of your setup and some recorded data. Right, that's pretty much it from me. So please let me know if you have any questions, or I mean, we're always looking for large-scale production data here to further validate the algorithm. So if you're interested in hearing more about it or getting involved, doing some listening tests or so on, you're welcome to let me know. Yeah, we can offer a lot of assistance in making this easy for you guys. All right, that was it. Thank you so much.